Comic books have always been an outsider medium in literary circles, regarded as a bit underground, a bit pulp. In the UK at least, graphic novels have rarely attained the literary credibility that other forms of fiction have. But graphic novels are beginning to infiltrate the mainstream more and more. Comic books adapted by Hollywood have broken box office records, and in recent years the Edinburgh Book Festival has acknowledged this phenomenon by featuring events with writers and artists working in the field.
A few years ago, DC Comics in the States wrote to me and asked me if I would be interested in writing for Hellblazer. And I wrote back and said I would eat my own guts to write Hellblazer. And I'm not the only writer who's desperate to work in this form. Ian Rankin has just published his first graphic novel, Dark Entries. So what makes an established writer with a very big dedicated fan base so keen to work in this area?
Well, I mean, this all came about when Vertigo themselves emailed me and said I'd ever thought of writing for a comic book. And they suggested some of their characters or said you could come up with your own ideas if you want. I had a lot of fun writing this because it started off as an Agatha Christie type story with lots of strangers gathered together in a haunted house and disappearing mysteriously one by one. So it's a take on that, but it's a reality TV, it's a closed set of a reality TV programme, and they're not supposed to be disappearing one by one. So it's also a sort of commentary on what we're doing with celebrity culture and reality television. And then halfway through it gets very, very strange indeed.
The godfather of graphic novels is Neil Gaiman, who appeared at the book festival this year along with Ian Rankin. Author of countless comic book titles, most famously the Sandman series, he's experienced the changing appreciation of the medium.
What would you say the difference is in status between graphic novels and prose writing?
When I started writing comics was as low as you could get. You know, in the grand status thing, there were the Booker Prize winning novelists, and then you'd go down a bit to journalists, you go down a little further to advertising, then you go to people writing on toilet walls, and somewhere beneath that was people who wrote comics. It's not that world anymore. It is a world where people get excited at the idea of graphic novels. And it's a world in which I get to be this grand old man.
At the heart of it is basic storytelling. You've got to have a good story, that's where you start. And then you think, how can the story be told? Is this a story that makes a good graphic novel? Or is this a story that makes a short story? Or is it a story that makes a radio story?
I don't think I believe that there are actually any divisions between high culture and low culture. I started writing comics because it seemed to me like an amazing art form and an amazing vehicle for telling stories that was being hugely underutilized. It's all part of that thing where you get to get ideas and stories out of your head and into the society.
Something like Watchmen, you know, I would certainly choose as one of my top 10 desert island books. You know, if I'm going to be on a desert island, I'm not going to take Proust or Tolstoy, I'm going to take Watchmen, because every time I read it, I see something I didn't see before, or I get some nuance, or I get some theme that emerges that, you know, I didn't pick up first time round, and that's, you know, I think that's a sign of literature.
Writing a comic is very different to writing a novel. For a start, it's collaborative, so you're working with an artist. And if you're writing a long-running series like Hellblazer, you have a character who has a long history, you're writing for a fan base who are incredibly invested in that character. So there are very different challenges than there are in writing a novel.
Part of the problem is that you have to have a very visual take on the world. And also you learn that novelists are the laziest writers in the world because, you know, we say things like the man walked into the pub and the reader does everything else for us, thank you very much. They paint in the background, they give everybody costumes, they give them faces, they have music playing if they want music playing, and they decide the point of view. Well, as a writer of graphic novels, comic books, whatever, you've got to do all that for the artist.
For me, a comic script is a letter to the artist. It's sort of like telepathy, because you're trying to get something out of your head and into theirs.
In a scene in a novel, you don't suddenly change from one perspective to another. You're not looking down from the ceiling, oh, now you're looking at their shoes from the floor, oh, now you're looking at the backs of their heads. But in a comic, you can and will do that. So you're actually being director, art director, you're doing the music, you're doing the script, you're the cameraman, you're pretty much everything. And I found that, you know, really, I had to think with a different part of my brain, I think.
There are things you can do in comics that you can't do in prose. In Sandman, there's a moment where somebody thinks he has actually managed to kill Morpheus, our title character, and he's sort of hanging in this white space, going, ha ha ha, he's dead, and you turn the page, and you realize the white space he's dancing on is actually Morpheus's hand, and he is this tiny little figure being held, and that's what the white was. And that's something that I couldn't do in prose. It's impossible to pull off that gag in prose without actually saying, and this is what's happening.
Ian Rankin and I are both known primarily for crime fiction, and it's easy to see why people coming from that kind of background would find a natural home in graphic novels. There are a lot of parallels in the darkness of the themes and the fact that the central characters tend to be outsiders. And also, one of the beautiful things about graphic novels is they very rarely arrive at a black and white resolution.
The writers of comics are interested in people on the margins of society, as are crime writers. I mean, crime writers are looking at people that don't quite fit in. We use them as our central characters or nearly central characters a lot because we're fascinated in what that says about the society around us and what happens to people once they're marginalised. What happens when they don't fit in. But of course, you know, the thing about comic books is the classic comic book would take a teenager who doesn't feel like they fit in and make them different but make them exceptional. And I think that's a great lesson for kids to learn, is that you might feel like you don't fit in but you're still exceptional.
What tends to happen as a writer is you follow your obsessions. You follow the things that fascinate you. You tell the stories that are sitting there in your head to be told. Some of my fiction tends to be, for the most part, dark and somehow hopeful. I love exploring the nature of reality. I love exploring the world we live in, and one way that you can really have fun exploring the world we're living in is to move slightly outside it. All the stuff that you take for granted suddenly becomes magical and new. And I think one of the things about sending people into other worlds, into things that are just at 45 degrees to the world they know in fiction, is when you send them home again. They get to see the world for the first time. And what you're doing there is actually giving them permission to discover that world.